Nigeria's expanded 2025 budget revenue target could strain its fragile fiscal position unless revenue mobilization is done and, of course, is more than doubled. With debt accumulation rising and foreign credit markets tightening, the government faces a widening deficit. The GDP rebasing may create a misleading borrowing headroom, increasing debt risks. And while new tax reforms are planned, political hurdles may stall implementation, leaving the country dependent on volatile oil revenue. So to put all this in perspective, I'm being joined by Abiodun Kayode-Alli, an economist and senior manager at PwC Nigeria. Thank you so much for joining us. Okay, so I can't hear you, so you may need to unmute your device. Okay, yes, I think I can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Awesome.
All right, you're welcome. And we also have Muktar Mohammed, CEO, Finance with Muktar. Good morning to you, sir. Can you please unmute? I cannot hear you too.
I can hear you now.
Okay,
I'm not
fantastic.
mute. I can hear you.
Okay. So let me quickly start with Abiodun. Now, Nigeria seems ambitious about its 41 trillion naira revenue target for 2025. But analysts warn it could widen the fiscal deficit if revenue projections fall short. How do you see it?
Yeah, that's actually a concern, given the fact that our debt is actually on the rise. So from my perspective, I think the amount being budgeted, I think it's okay in terms of our needs. I think the main concern should be on the spending, what it's actually being spent for. In terms of revenue generation, I would say that the government, the administration has actually been doing fine in terms of collections from non-oil taxes. I think the only concern would be Nigeria is able to take advantage of its capacity to actually produce enough crude oil. And I can see that there have been clearly plans that have been put in place. So if we're able to actually change the way we're going to source for the deficit 13 trillion, which you've made mention of, about 69% of it, 70% is actually going to be spent with additional borrowings, 2% on equity, while the balancing 28% will be gotten from multilateral and bilateral tied loans. I think the concern would be the borrowings. It's been one of the principles of the budget debt management office to actually ensure that foreign borrowings are 40%, while 60% for local borrowings. I think we should probably consider increasing that of local borrowings, and I think the government should probably recalibrate the 70% I made mention of, which they want to give to borrowings. I think there should be strategies to ensure that we actually do more of the privatization and asset sale. I think that would help us in the long run, and most importantly, what you spend it on is what matters eventually at the end of the day. If you spend it on things that will expand productivity, I think that will help. And I know you made reference to taxes initially. The government, part of the reasons why the government actually raised the expenditure target is because they want to, or they see some benefits. I can call it the windfall benefit from taxation. So towards the end of last year, there was the windfall tax that was passed into law, the Finance Act of 2024, which was to actually show up its revenue. So we've seen that the tax authorities has actually been sending letters to the banks. And the reason why the FRS is doing this is because of the benefits that are assumed to have been gained by the banks during the period when the liberalization policy, 13th of June 2023, took effect. So they're actually expecting to get these revenues this year. So that's why they've actually raised the revenue targets, Lekon.
Okay, Muktar, just listening to Abiodun now talking about, of course, sources whereby Nigeria can raise these funds. But then it seems like the Nigerian government is not learning from its antecedents. It couldn't meet the 36.35 trillion naira revenue target for 2023 due to revenue shortfalls, policy adjustments leading to economic pressure that we saw, and debt servicing. Now it is projecting 41 trillion naira in revenue. And some people say that, it's like seeing a garden of thorns from a cliff and still taking a dive. Don't you think that is?
In a government that doesn't seem to do anything different and want to have a different result, we always end in a mirage of confusion and economic stagnation in this instance. Like you pointed out, we keep doing the same thing over and over again, and we think we have a different result. That's not possible. Look at the government. You remember that at a point, their projected revenue will have a budget deficit. I think about 13 trillion. They now say they discover new revenue areas, and they resubmitted the budget again to approve that and increase their revenue rather than using that to reduce the deficit of what they already have. And today now we're already having those challenges in terms of the budget deficits, and we'll continue to have it because our main source of income is crude oil. Our benchmark exchange rate is $76 per barrel. At yesterday, it was $69 per barrel. So what you begin to see is that we might have to see more of those budget deficits, especially as it has to do with capital expenditure. I can tell you that that's where we suffer. When it comes to salary and allowance, debt services, we will definitely do that because we don't have an option. We are tied to do that. And even when we cannot, we may have to go and borrow to do that. But when it comes to capital project, then you begin to see a lot of abandoned projects because the resources, the funds are not there to carry it out. So government have not learned from their lessons. Government seems to do things again and again. And this present administration can be surprised to be an administration that have not been financially prudent in terms of management of the resources, that the little resources in terms of their cabinet, the amount of people that you have in cabinet. This is the largest cabinet in the history of this country, and yet this is the government that thinks that they have refused less revenue from oil, which is true. But again, they are not doing any other thing to see how they can begin to look at reducing their excesses in management, in allowances, in a lot of things that they need to look at and cut it off. But I don't think they are doing that. They just seem to go about things like if it's business as usual. So that's where I have my challenge. But to say the government is doing anything different, I don't think they are doing anything different that any other administration have done. So if you look at the monetary policy, it's the same that happened during Emefiele that's happening during Cardoso. The only difference in terms of Cardoso working tirelessly to see how he can bring down FX and volatility. And what you gain, like my colleague said, what you gain in terms of non-oil sector, in terms of that, I think we tend to get a lot in terms of volume, but in terms of value, which have to do with cash, we definitely see more coming from the oil sector. So that sector is a key driver of the Nigerian economy. Once that success struggle, once that sector is struggling, the Nigerian economy is definitely struggling.
Well, even the Naira that was actually gaining ground a couple of weeks ago started depreciating as we see it, looking at the policies of government. But Abiodun, you talked about borrowings and the areas that the Nigerian government need to look into. Now, when President Bola Tinubu initially proposed a budget of about 49.74 trillion Naira, he estimated a deficit of course, at 3.89% of GDP. Now, post-adjustments, the legislature reviewed and increased the budget to 54.99 trillion Naira, reporting the deficit at 1.52% of GDP after the rebasing. So does it mean that the revenue target was deliberately overestimated in order to justify more borrowings?
Thank you, Liko. So I won't exactly put it that way, but definitely the rebasing effect that we are seeing for the GDP numbers, even for the inflation that we saw, it helps to put things in positive light, and it actually kind of gives them that bandwidth to be able to make more borrowings. But like Muktar said, it shouldn't be a case for recklessness, right? So yes, it might play to their advantage given the fact that we have to rebase, right? And we've been expected to rebase every 5 years, but all the same, it shouldn't give them that kind of leverage or leeway to actually spend recklessly. So I won't say that all these were done deliberately to go into more borrowings. I won't say that. But apart from looking at the deficit to GDP, I would also say that there are other parameters that you can use to tell whether Nigeria is doing a good job with respect to its borrowings, right? So looking away from these parameters, I think one thing that is key is, as much as possible, whenever the country borrows, we should actually be spending it on the productive sector. We should actually be spending to make sure that we have enough resources to pay it back. If you consider the fact that our current debt stock is high, somewhere within the range of 150 trillion, that's quite high, and it speaks to how we've managed things historically, right? So I think the government should actually use this opportunity from getting a better picture through the rebasing to actually carry on more productive activities. So I'll give you a good example. Looking at how the MPC committee's decision has been impacted by the new rebasing of the CPI, right? We've seen that the Monetary Policy Committee have been able to hold rates, and in holding rate, they've actually ensured that the cost of borrowing is not increased. If they hadn't done this, I can guarantee you that the 12 members of the committee would have probably voted for a hike, right? But they've actually held rates constant, and this actually helps manufacturers, producers, and in the long run, it helps consumers, right? So I do think that the government should also take advantage of the GDP rebasing for something positive rather than borrowing to spend recklessly. That's my thought on that, Leko.
Okay, so 153 trillion in debt, Muktar, and it seems the governments would be more active in domestic debt accumulation, something that Abiodun said earlier, and that will potentially crowd out the private sector operators. So can Nigeria continue to rely on these now credit-shy foreign markets to always provide a lifeline? Peradventure, the domestic market is not able to provide the funds needed.
Not really. The foreign market should be attractive now because, one, you are trying to build your FX reserve. So definitely the foreign market should be very, very attractive for them rather than the domestic market, like you said. By borrowing the domestic market, they are carrying out the private sector. But unfortunately, that's not what they will do. Because of if you look at the rate of returns in the local market, it's easier for them to manage than what they get in the foreign market. Because the foreign market, you realize that our Eurobond or whatever instrument we are giving is the highest in terms of coupon. We are giving above, way above other countries. And so that's why you see that it's generally largely oversubscribed. So, and again, you have the challenge of FX. So when time comes for this payment to be made, that means they will exert more pressure on the exchange rate, and that could lead to a high exchange rate. I think that is where they are. That's why they try to rush to local borrowing. But like my colleague said, one thing is certain, the rebasing was all geared towards two things: give a gap for them to borrow more based on rebasing, then also use rebasing as a means of controlling inflation. And it's only in Nigeria you see that happen, whereby rebasing is not a tool to control inflation, even if all the inflation variables remain the same. But because you have rebased, you now think you have dealt with inflation. Because what I said so is that food inflation is still high cost of transportation, high household are still struggling to meet needs. So all those things are there, even based on the report that was given by the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics. And I think they do that 10% reduce in them. In inflation really also put a span on the work of the CBN. And that's why I feel that just say, you know what, let's study this, let's hold the rate, and let's give ourselves a long time. That's why they are moving the next monetary committee meeting to September. So I think it's just like what happened some years ago on, I think, one of your program. And I said GDP is not what you use to pay your debts. It's not the good GDP that will pay your debt. It's the revenue. How much of revenue do you have to pay off your debt? So it's the same thing I'm saying. GDP growth, fantastic. GDP will give you room to expand, to do more borrowing. But has GDP growth been able to put food on the table of the ordinary Nigeria? That has not happened. Rebasing in itself is good because it's supposed to be done every 5 years. Rebasing in itself is good, but any rebasing that will not bring money, that will not bring food to the table of the ordinary Nigeria, and also attract foreign investors into your market, is magic, it's economic magic. The whole idea of rebasing is for you to create new avenue for people to want to come into your economy. They see new prospect, they see new economic trend, and they come in there where foreign investor to expand that sector, to invest on that sector. But when you are doing rebasing just to say, oh, we are the largest economy in Africa, and that does not attract investors, and that does not reduce the rate of poverty, and that does not put food in the in the table of the other Nigeria. Is just economic magic.
Yes, of course, just as you said, experts have actually said that without significant economic expansion, that the targets that the budget is hoping to achieve might not be achievable. So, Abiodun, when you look at government's economic reforms, can we rely on that to provide the needed, finance and robust framework for economic expansion?
I think one thing is key is that Nigeria actually does have the capacity to solve its problems, right? We have the population, we have the minds. I think government just needs to stay true to its plans, right? And we have brilliant minds who have come up with lots of economic plans, lots of development plans. And one thing we must say is that as long as we are staying true to the course with respect to implementation, I do think we can actually solve our problems, right? A good example I'll give you is, remember, last year there was a point in time when we were trying to address food inflation, and we said we're going to remove the import duties, right, on food that is being brought into the country. Well, it took a while before it was implemented. We're waiting for letters from one agency to another agency from a ministry, right? So I do think that if every MDA is actually working in sync, I do think we can get the needed results. Now, to your question directly, the reforms that the government has put in place, I do think the reforms are actually meant to spur investment. If you look at some of the reforms in the oil and gas sector with respect to removal of some of the taxes like the VAT, I do think it's good enough to actually spur investment. And if you also consider the tax reforms that are coming into place, the essence is to ensure that as much as possible, you get people who are able to pay taxes to actually pay taxes, right? And I think it's better when you compare it to the existing companies that we see the tax authorities constantly given different forms of assessment and liabilities, right? It's more like trying to tax the same people who are regularly paying taxes, right? So I think as much as possible, being able to diversify and bring in more people to actually pay taxes, as well as save the vulnerable, I think to a long extent to actually increase our tax to GDP ratio, which is currently at 10% to somewhere within the range of 18%, the average for Africa. I think to a large extent that helps, right? And there are policies to also actually attract employment in Nigeria. Muktar has talked about how rebasing might actually want to give the government some advantages, right? We know that the recent unemployment rate in Nigeria is 5%, even though we know that it's not really productive. But I think some of the reforms are actually trying to ensure that our youths get employed without actually bringing most of the companies. They get employed, they get foreign jobs, and from getting foreign jobs, they also source FX, right? And this actually helps our situation. So if we're able to do this, create employment, there is also the opportunity to grow the pie and actually get taxes. So from a tax perspective, I think it's good. Reforms in the oil and gas sector, I think a lot more needs to be done with respect to implementation. Then in the long run, Nigeria will actually gain the needed revenue. So I think these are some of the things Nigeria can do. In addition to one thing I said earlier, which is actually to expand the sale of assets and get the private sector to play more role. Because if you look at our National Development Plan, which we created in 2021 to 2025, right, the expectation is that out of the 348 trillion that will be spent in actually expanding capital infrastructure, the private sector was expected to spend 298. So I do think Nigeria has enough to actually ensure that there is sufficient investment. Nigeria just has to do a lot with respect to soft infrastructure, which is the policies that we put in place. We need to follow through to the end. That's what I think, Leko.
All right, so Muktar, part of what the government has said is that it will be looking at revenue from FIRS, Nigeria Customs Service, the non-oil sector, so to speak. Now, do you think that maybe additional revenues from these areas can substantially cover for the lapses?
Ordinarily, it should. But again, you need to look at inflation. Like Abiodun just said, they came up with a policy of removal of tariff on food item. But maybe Abiodun, maybe you are not aware that that policy did not see the light of the day. And up to this moment, I don't think that policy have seen the light of the day. They have not sneaked it into the tax reform bill. Because I remember then Customs said, no, we have to get it's a constitutional matter. So we wasted 6 months waiting for that to happen, and it has not happened. And I don't think it's happening anytime soon. So that would have driven down inflation, especially now that they're excited about bringing the inflation by 10%. I am an advocate of taxes, especially widening the tax bracket. But when you hear Nigerian government talk about widening the tax bracket, it's more or less taxing the already taxed. So I think they should begin to think of widening the tax bracket. Now, how do you widen the tax bracket? Again, it's another issue altogether. Do you widen the tax bracket by taxing the already taxed or getting new people into your tax net, especially the informal sector? If the government can get the informal sector into their tax net, it's going to be a game changer in terms of revenue, in terms of what they will get. Because again, I'm talking about the SMEs, I'm talking about the informers, I'm talking about the vulcanizer, I'm talking about the Yasikira that is selling rice on the street, the guy that's riding keke nape and all that. Those are the informal sector. That is the key driver of the Nigerian economy. But what we have seen government try to do is to levy that sector. Levy itself is not substantiate. It cannot be sustained when it comes to levies. And we've seen that what Nigerian governments thrive on, what politicians thrive on is levies. And levies give room for a lot of corruption. While taxes open up your economy, give room for new investors, give room for innovation and creativity. So government should move from the way of levies, because all the funds that they are trying to get, if we are trying to tell them, oh, get Nigeria into the tax levy, but most of them love taking Nigeria to the tax, getting more revenue by levies. So that's why you travel around the road, you come even in a state like Lagos, you see a lot of hoodlums, or what I call them, miscreant, or what I call them employed people harassing people to collect levies, rather than government coming up with a blueprint for people to be able to, on their own, walk into any place to pay taxes. So taxes itself is a major revenue boost for the Nigerian economy in terms of population. But again, why we are not seeing that effect in terms of our revenue is because the formal sector still are the large drivers of revenue that comes from taxes. The informal sector that controls virtually 70 to 80% of the Nigerian economy seems not to be paying enough taxes, or not even paying at all.
Okay, now I understand, Muktar. Now let's still focus more on the issue around diversification and the non-oil sector. Now, Abiodun, we are aware that efforts are being made to diversify revenue sources, part of the things that you mentioned a while ago. But economists say that, still talking about the non-oil revenue generation drive, it has not yet reached levels that can substantially reduce the country's fiscal vulnerabilities. Muktar just mentioned the informal sector now, and the fact that a lot has not been done in seeing that though the players within that sector are being harmonized or incorporated into Nigeria's tax regime. So would you say that that is a huge challenge that the tax reform bills cannot solve?
So I'll just take a different route. For the informal sector, I like I said earlier, yes, I do agree that we have a lot of the formal entities bearing a lot of the burden, the tax burden, in the sense that the companies that we can see, the visible ones, they are the ones that keep paying most of the existing taxes, and they are the ones flooded with lots of taxes. The informal sector, to be quite honest, they also actually pay lots of taxes. I think the problem now is that there is a lot of leakage. Like Muktar alluded to, most of the people who actually collect these taxes, they are non-state actors, right, who actually collect it, and it doesn't end up in government coffers. We see that a lot, especially in places like Lagos State. So some of the modifications we're expecting to see with the tax reform bill is that these non-state actors are actually taken out of the picture, right? The expectation is that the number of taxes that are paid are fewer. If you consider a lot of the young men who are actually pushing wheelbarrow, or the ladies who are actually hawking for food, the women hawking for food, you discover that there are people who would collect one certain amount before they can actually begin to sell their product. So if we can remove most of these illegal taxes and just focus it on a few, right, and exempt most of these people, because most of these people, they're actually living from hand to mouth, right? So if you can exempt them from most of these taxes, Nigeria, we have enough sufficient people, let me just say the rich, the extremely rich people, who can actually fund most of the revenue needs of the government. And we've seen cases like that in advanced countries like South Africa, right, where majority of in fact, in South Africa, personal income tax actually is the major revenue earner for the South African government. And what is collected in personal income tax is way more than what we collect in total taxes, right? Our largest taxes that are collected in Nigeria are the company's income tax and the value-added tax, right? And South Africa dwarfs what we collect, and South Africa's population is not as much as ours. So I think the reform trying to focus on payment of taxes to those who actually have the capacity to pay, and using technology and using data and intelligence to actually get these people to the tax line, I think that will go a long way in actually plugging most of these loopholes that we have. So I do think that the tax reform bills actually has enough to actually cater for the revenue needs. Then one other thing I said is that there are a lot of exemptions that are given. Individuals who can't pay, as well as small companies who can't pay. And that actually helps them in actually expanding their businesses to the point whereby they then expand, they develop, and they become able to pay. I do think that in that extent, the tax reform bills is actually going to help. But key things I must make reference to is to stop the leakages, ensure that revenue is collected centrally, right? Revenue is collected by the Federal Inland Revenue Service, the Nigerian Revenue Service, as the change intends to introduce, right? And also ensure that technology data is actually being used in collecting these taxes. I do think Nigeria can go far in terms of revenue generation. Then one other key thing I must say also is if government agencies can actually stop getting in the way of most of these companies that want to actually do business. We've seen instances whereby probably it's at the customs, we have people, producers who want to import items to actually use in producing in the country. We've seen instances where they are having difficulties, they're having challenges as a result of one administrative body or the other, right? I think if government can actually ensure that most of these policies that are aimed at easing the cost of doing business, if they can actually follow through, I think to a large extent we'll be able to solve the problem of manufacturing in the country. Okay. Right? So those are my thoughts, Lekon, with respect to expectation of revenue generation.
Okay, so Muktar, I mean, we're still talking about fiscal prudency. Now, there is a proposed South-South Development Commission that's been allocated 140 billion naira in the 2025 budget. Now, people are asking the question, what's the difference between SSDC and the NDDC? I mean, is the Niger Delta region not in the South-South? If we're talking about cutting costs, if we're talking about reducing expenses, and we're having these sorts of provisions in the budget.
I said it when we started. I said this is an administration that has involved more in financial recklessness in terms of the way through political appointees or trying to satisfy politicians. It's not just the Niger Delta Development Commission or the Niger Delta or the South-South Development Commission. You know, we have the North Central Development Commission, we have the South-West Development Commission. All these were created during this administration. So definitely that shows that we are an administration. They are the administration that have not really sat down to look at what really can work. How can we make the country work? But they are looking at the political side of virtually everything they are doing for me, and that is a major challenge. So I think the government need to look at its spending, look at them. They are trying to do too much and trying to also not have the capacity and to block the leakages. Because the thing I like about the tax reform bill is the area that we're giving company income tax that was also reduced for large companies. That it goes a long way, and so I think that bill is more or less one of the best bill in terms of taxes and using tax to grow your economy rather than thinking like tax is just a means of revenue. I think that is one area we need to begin to change our mindset about. Look at tax as a means to grow the economy rather than tax as a means to pay debt or to get more money to pay debts. We also can use tax to attract major players into our country, being through tax holidays. So, and they will in turn employ a lot of Nigerians who immediately start paying taxes, but is the company income tax that will not be charged because you are giving them a tax holiday. So all these are things that the tax committee should bring to the table and be able to address those issues so that in moving forward, you get more Nigerians in the tax bracket. And let me tell you, Nigerians are not difficult people, but if I'm running a business and I have to provide power for myself, I have to provide security for myself, I have to even sometimes make the road usable for myself, then what basis do you have to come and collect taxes from me? I think that's where is the problem. So that's why they hire all these hoodlums to arrest these guys on the way and collect levies from them. I keep saying levies will not take your economy anywhere in the world. The best thing that can grow your economy is taxes, not levies.
Well, of course, we know that Nigerians are faced with economic realities every day, and we would hope that whatever economic measure that the government will be bringing on board, it will be people and business-centric. And that is the only way that the Nigerian economy can grow. Abiodun Kayode-Alli, Economist and Senior Manager at PwC Nigeria, and of course, Muktar Mohammed, CEO, Finance with Muktar. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for sharing your thoughts with us on the show.